Hello and welcome to Since Attlee Churchill, the podcast about British political history since the Second World War. I'm Lee Evans, a historian of the Conservative Party.
And I'm Richard Johnson, a historian of the Labour Party, and Lee's husband. In each midweek episode, we are marvelling at glorious pearls of contemporary British political interest.
This episode is coming out on polling day for local elections across much of England and also parliamentary elections for the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Parliament too. In our main episode this week, we spoke about one of the most dramatic historical parallels that people might be thinking about in the coming days. That was 1968, when Harold Wilson suffered a pasting at the polls, just 2 years after winning a landslide election victory, a situation that I think Keir Starmer will soon sympathise with quite a lot. And in this podcast, I wanted to look at some of the other ways in which we can contextualise what's going to unfold in this year's local elections here in the UK. The first really is to serve as a cross-party warning for those who think that these local elections are necessarily going to bring about the downfall of Keir Starmer as Prime Minister. Because whilst we spoke about Harold Wilson's worst local elections and the plotting that came afterwards, plotting, of course, that he managed to survive, if we flip over to the other side of the House of Commons and the Conservative Party, we can also find an example of their worst local elections, certainly in recent history, and what happened after that. So in 1995, by this stage, it's 3 years since the Conservatives won their fourth successive election victory, 3 of them under Margaret Thatcher, the last one under John Major. But any of the excitement or applause that may have once surrounded John Major as an election fighter had dissipated to the point of non-existence. And in the May 1995 local elections, the Conservatives lost a staggering 2,018 councillors and the control of 58 councils. The projected Conservative vote share was just 25%, whereas Labour's was 47%, and they gained over 1,800 councillors. The Lib Dems, in this case, certainly on vote share, were not far behind the Conservatives at all and gained almost 500 councillors. I mean, this was really the low point for John Major's premiership. I remember an old friend of mine who sadly died towards the end of last year, but was a long-standing Conservative councillor in West Cheshire. And he had a seat on what was then the Borough Council in a post-industrial town just off the River Mersey. He had done quite well to win that and to hold it in successive elections. But I remember him telling me about 1995 when he lost, and people just coming up to him and saying, "Not this time, Miles, not this time." The Conservatives managed to win none of the Metropolitan Borough Councils that were up for election on that day. They won none of the new unitary councils, single-tier local government, that were up for election on that day. Labour were winning majorities in places like North East Lincolnshire. And of the 167 district councils where all of the seats were up, the Tories only won control of 4 of them: Arran, South Staffordshire, Spelthorne and Surrey Heath. Dozens of them were lost to either Labour, the Liberal Democrats, or no overall control. So that's the scale of the defeat that John Major suffered in 1995. And the interesting thing about it is, in terms of thinking about what might happen now, is it did lead to intense speculation about the leadership and the desire to get rid of John Major. What John Major did on that occasion is something which people have not done very often. He actually brought on the contest himself. He resigned as Conservative leader and then stood in the race to be his own successor. We did a podcast episode all about that actually back in September, called "Why Did John Major Resign and Then Stand Again for the Tory Leadership?", which you can find wherever you get your podcasts. And then in spite of this electoral mauling, only one person from this cabinet decides that they're willing to take on John Major. In that case, it was John Redwood. And John Major wins 218 votes from MPs compared to just 89 for his challenger, in what is by then agreed to be the last leadership contest, or the last opportunity to vote on the leadership, that side of a general election that everybody expects the Conservatives to lose. So why do I mention this? Well, if we're thinking about what's going to unfold in these local elections, which has been marked in everybody's calendar, every pundit's calendar certainly, as the day or the days when the pressure on Keir Starmer might prove intolerable, and that something will happen around his leadership. Well, in 68 and also in 95, prime ministers who quite possibly had even worse days at the polls than Keir Starmer and Labour are going to have this week managed to survive in fact, quite convincingly, to fight another day. And so anybody who is simply hoping that pressure on Starmer because of poor election results is going to be enough to see us change Prime Minister is going to need to think quite a bit more creatively about how to bring that about.
I think that's a very good point, because Keir Starmer is not the first leader of a political party to experience very, very bad results, particularly an incumbent Prime Minister. In fact, it's something of a norm that the government of the day sees losses in a local council election when that party is in government. And as we already discussed in our Sunday episode in 1968, it is not unheard of for there to be speculation about the fate of the leadership after such an election result. And yet, so rarely do we see prime ministers brought down by local elections. I mean, I think the only case that I can really think of in the post-war era where it was a local election result that ended a leadership is potentially Theresa May in 2019, particularly after the European election results, where we had, in my view, the ridiculous situation in which Britain had to vote on a brand new set of MEPs at a time when we had already given a very clear instruction that we were leaving the European Union. In that campaign, the Tories got 9% of the vote or something like that.
Came in fifth.
Even then, I think it can be argued that it wasn't purely the European election results that brought her down. It was the fact that she was unable to get through what had become the central legislative piece of that parliamentary session, which was the withdrawal bill. And the numerous defeats that she had endured were, in normal parliamentary times, would have been completely unbearable for any government, or indeed any prime minister. I say that because for months now, people have said to me, wait till the local elections. That's when it will become clear that people need to get rid of Keir Starmer. And it may be the case, and who knows, once this podcast goes out, the leadership candidates may be preparing their nominations and declaring their candidacies, and by the end of the month, Keir Starmer may be gone. But I think people have put far too much stock in the idea that it is going to be a local election result that removes the Prime Minister. And what I've been saying to people for months, as someone who personally has very little time for Keir Starmer and be very happy to see the back of him, never wanted him to become leader in the first place for his role as Shadow Brexit Secretary, which I think was disastrous for the Labour Party and has contributed to many of the problems that Labour faces at the moment. I said to them, don't wait to the local elections. If you think he's a catastrophic leader, a terrible prime minister, someone who is damaging the government, the party, and the country, then move against him now. Don't wait until May. There's nothing that we're going to learn in May that we didn't know earlier this year, to be quite honest with you. And I still hold that view.
There are two more things I wanted to say about putting into context these local elections. Actually, the second of which is a bit of a prediction, which I'll come on to shortly. But I also wanted to think about the Conservatives and to ask the question, how often does the main opposition party lose seats in local elections in between general elections? And I've gone back over the last few decades to try and find the occasions and when that happens. And they tend to cluster, actually, interestingly. And there's something we can read from that. So in local elections like 1981, 1982 and 1985, the Labour Party was losing seats, not always that many, but sometimes quite a few. They were losing seats in local elections. You then have to go until 2016 to find a time when the main opposition party loses seats again. So 2016, 2017 and 2019, they are all under the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn. And then interestingly, that trend actually continues, albeit in fairly extraordinary circumstances in 2021, when Keir Starmer is leader of the Labour Party and leader of the opposition. Labour loses seats in those elections. That's the same day as the mythologised Hartlepool by-election, and also, we're told, the point at which Keir Starmer actually considered resigning the Labour leadership because things seemed to be going so poorly for him. History could have been very different then. And then there's 2025, just last year, when the Conservatives lost seats as well. So what can we see from those clusters and that little pattern? Well, basically that there seem to be two circumstances in which main opposition parties lose elections. One, if there is a very popular government. Well, it could well be in 1982 with the Falklands effect benefiting Margaret Thatcher, and certainly in 2021 where there was that big Boris bounce in the opinion polling following the COVID pandemic, beginning to roll out the vaccines. The government was quite popular at that time. Of course, that would change later on that year as the Partygate scandal began to unfold, but May of 2021 was a very good time for the Conservatives. The other time when it happens is, as we're going through now, when there is a splintering of the vote on that particular wing of politics. So that's also the case in the early mid-1980s, of course, as the SDP and the SDP Liberal Alliance are asserting themselves and trying to rival and take over from the Labour Party. And it is also, of course, the case now, thinking about the 2025 and what all the forecasts say will also be the 2026 example of the main opposition party losing seats when there is a fracturing on that side of politics. Now, of course, with Reform UK taking a lot of Conservative votes. But in spite of what seem certain to be Conservative losses in these elections, I actually want to make a tentative forecast, or at least something that I think could happen, which would at the very least give the Conservatives a chance to push back a little against the narrative. And that's this. After these local elections, it's perfectly possible that the Conservative Party becomes once again the largest party in local government in England. So I'll just explain my thinking on this. And actually what got me thinking about it was in fact 1995, because the mid-90s stand out as being the point at which the Conservatives fell to third in terms of local government representation, as they were surpassed by the Lib Dems. But if we focus on England and this current 2026 local election cycle, Peter Kellner, the pollster, has put out a chart in which it says what would joy, relief, disappointment or disaster look like for all of the respective parties. And that's how many seats would they have to win to feel that way, based on how many they're defending, where they are in the polls and where expectations lie. So, of course, the best ones are joy, then relief, down to disappointment, and then disaster. If you look at the current lay of the land in local government in England, in terms of how many councillors each of the parties has, and if you take Labour's disappointment forecast, which would see them lose 1,657 seats on Thursday, if you take the Tories' relief forecast, so a slightly better outcome for the Conservatives, that would see them lose still 662 seats. We could end up, based on my estimates of what I could find out about the current composition of local government in England, with the Conservatives on 3,543 councillors and Labour on 3,472 councillors. So the Conservatives would, by losing fewer seats than Labour is going to lose, overtake Labour in terms of local government representation. Now, you may ask, can people not then overtake the Conservatives as well? Well, for either Reform or the Greens to do that, they would basically have to win pretty much everything. They've not been on the up in enough local government cycles in order to have a broad base in local government, particularly in those councils that are only up in thirds or only up in part. The Lib Dems could potentially do it. Interestingly, if you also give the Lib Dems their relief forecast, same as I gave the Conservatives in this hypothetical, they would get to 3,378 councillors. So you would have the three old parties of British politics, Labour, the Conservatives and the Lib Dems, all within a couple of hundred seats of each other in terms of how many councillors they have in England. And so if I permit myself to have a little bit of optimism bias about the Conservatives, which regular listeners in particular will forgive me, I'm sure, for having, I think it's worth this week, and I will certainly be tallying the figures. And if I was in central office in particular, I'd be keeping my fingers crossed that they could say by the end of this weekend that the Conservatives are now the biggest party in local government again. But time will tell.
Time will tell indeed. I have to say that I felt Peter Kellner's chart was a bit dodgy, to be quite honest with you. When he writes disaster, he puts a disaster for Labour at winning 500, Tories winning 300, Lib Dems winning 600, Greens winning 350. For Reform, he says a disaster result for them would be gaining 1,400 council seats, which is higher than what he puts as the maximum joy for the Conservatives. He puts them at 900 versus 1,400 as the disaster for Reform. So Reform's disaster is actually still winning 500 more council seats than the Tories. 1,000 for the Lib Dems as their joy. So the Lib Dems winning 400 fewer seats than Reform would be a disaster for Reform and joy for the Lib Dems. And the Greens, he puts their joy at 800, but Reform's disaster at 1,400. So I understand Reform is leading in the polls, but I have to say that I do think that this is a little bit of unscientific expectation management here on the part of Peter Kellner, because it just seems totally implausible to me that the very worst disastrous scenario for Reform is, according to him, far better than the very best wonderful scenario for all of the other parties except for Labour.
I hear your point, and I can't speak for him, of course, but I would suppose that these figures, certainly when I looked at these figures, I suppose that they were based on, as you referenced, current opinion polling, the seats that are up this time and who they're most likely to vote for. And therefore, it tries to bake in all that we know about where these elections will be taking place and what we can expect to happen in them if the opinion polls are correct. So the good news for Reform, and what Reform can take from that, is certainly even if the opinion polling slump that they've seen in recent months, so the last 6 months or so, even if that is true, and Reform is doing much worse than it was 6, 7, 8, 9 months ago, they will still be gaining a lot of seats because, of course, these are parts of the country where they contested nothing last time. So Reform are in a very fortunate position in this election cycle where there's basically nothing for them to lose. Now, they don't have seats really that are up this time, except for a handful that they've won in by-elections, etc. They can't lose anything. The only way is up. But of course, the question is, how much will Reform be up? And how much will they take from the other parties? And I think it's all the expectations around that Kellner has tried to bake into it. But I do take your point. It's on the face of it at least, it's a funny old world in which a disastrous result is 1,400 gains. Richard, what's your matter of interest this week?
My matter of interest this week is flags flying on lampposts. For those listeners who live in England, since last summer, you've probably noticed, either in the town that you live or as you've travelled around the country, that there have been British flags and English flags that have been affixed to various lampposts. And this has been part of some kind of activity by various groups of differing levels of reputability, and also by individuals as a form of kind of local initiative. The reason I raise it now is because I was asked recently about my opinion on flags on lampposts, because I am standing in a town council by-election in the town that we live in Oxfordshire. The town council by-election, by the way, is not on the same day that everyone else in the country is voting. It's going to be later in the month of May, on the 21st of May. And I introduced myself on the local town Facebook page and said that I was standing for the local election. And the only question that anyone asked me on that Facebook page was, what is my opinion about the flags that fly on the lampposts in our town? And so I thought I'd reflect on what I said in response to that. So the first thing to say is I do not agree with people who view the flying of the British flag or the English flag in England as divisive, offensive, or inappropriate. They are our national flags. This is our nation. We should be proud to fly them. There should be no apology for flying them. These are flags that belong to us all, and I don't accept efforts to shy away from the display of our flags. I'm very happy to see when our flags are flying. I fly the flags myself. I go to sporting matches where the flags are flown prominently. I've flown the flag. The flag instills me great sense of pride and belonging. I also think, particularly speaking as someone on the left, someone who's standing as a Labour candidate in this town council by-election, that it is wrong for the left in particular to be squeamish about the flag. And so when I see the flag displayed and people wanting to fly the flag, I do not react by thinking that that is inherently a nasty or divisive action. When it comes to flying them on lampposts, however, I think there is a technical, and perhaps this is somewhat of a seeming as a cop-out, but I think it's just trying to be consistent with my understanding of the law point to be made here, which is that I believe the law is, according to the Town and Country Planning Act, that if you are to display some kind of object on traffic infrastructure, like a road sign or a lamppost, then you need to get express permission from the relevant local authority in order to do that. And in the case of these flags that have been put up around towns like the one that we live in almost all of those cases, they have not sought or received permission to put the flags up. Therefore, I think it is correct for councils to enforce their rules and to take them down in a timely and appropriate manner. Do I think it's the most important thing for the council to do? No. But do I think that the councils should enforce the rules? Yes, I do. I say this because I said the same thing back in 2023 when, where I work in Mile End in London, there were, after the 7th of October attacks in Israel, there were Palestinian flags that were put up and down the lampposts of Mile End Road and left there for months and months. And after 3, 4, 5 months, I said that I think it's time now the council takes them down. They're not meant to be up there. And I thought it was a problem, actually, that the council was not enforcing the rules. So I say the same with these flags. Again, I don't think it's the most important thing. I'm not offended by seeing my national flags flying. I would welcome the national flags to be flown, but they just need to be flown in settings that are consistent with the rules. And so if people want to see more places where the flags are flown, then that's their democratic right to express that view. And I think that they should inform their elected officials, local councillors, whether that's a town councillor, like the position that I'm standing for, or higher tier councils, to see if the councils can facilitate the flying of flags more on public buildings, in public spaces, and also encourage people to fly flags privately, off in their gardens, from their windows, whatever the case may be. I'm perfectly happy for that to happen. So that's my position. Perhaps it's a position that pleases no one or angers everyone, but I'm just being consistent, and if people don't like that, then they can choose not to vote for me, and many of them won't. I'm fairly relaxed about that, but that's my position.
It's an interesting issue that I think has been of quite significant local salience in large parts of the country, if not necessarily national salience. That there are parts of the country where lots of these flags have gone up and have sparked significant debate. I agree with much of what you've said. Certainly I agree with the position that the British flag, the Union flag, is not a racist or inappropriate symbol to have flown in this country. Nor, as you sometimes hear councils say, this is not my view either, nor is it necessarily or obviously dangerous for drivers that it would be flown on lampposts or elsewhere. That's one of the arguments I've heard some local authorities make. Well, roads are littered with all sorts of signage and other things. I do not think the addition of a flag on a lamppost 30 feet in the air is necessarily adding to that at all. But I do take the view, and rather like you've expressed it, that lampposts are public infrastructure and they cannot just be taken over by any one group of people to use in a way that they decide they want to, without some form of permission or consent. It's also, we should say, fairly dangerous for the people who are putting them up. I don't think it's dangerous for drivers necessarily, but it can be quite dangerous for the people who are going and putting them up, sometimes quite late at night, raising these flags. And there is at least one case, I think, of somebody who died falling from a lamppost when they were putting a flag up. And the other thing where I'm critical of it is that they ought not do, as there have been some reported cases of, they ought not be aggressive towards council staff or contractors who are being paid by their local council to take them down, which has sometimes been where tensions have escalated in recent months. What would I do about it? Well, what I probably wouldn't do It's actually what a lot of councils have started doing so far, and spending tens of thousands of pounds taking down the flags. The reason I wouldn't do that at the moment, and certainly wouldn't rush to do that, one of them is that quite often when you see these flags, they're not particularly good quality flags. No, they're not the sort of thing that when there's a state visit in town, you see lining the Mall in London, on the way down to Buckingham Palace. Before too long, they will look quite tatty. Particularly the England flags, of course, which have so much white on them that they easily start to stain and look dirty and look quite tatty. And there would be a shift in public mood, in my view, once they started to not look like they were decorating, but that they were looking quite dirty and, making a mess of the public realm and public spaces. I think there would start to be a mood change against them and people would want to see them come down. The other thing I would do is I would actually encourage more official flags. Now, I know this divides opinion and some people think it's an awful American thing. And with apologies to our American listeners, some of those people might say it's a bit vulgar to fly the flag a lot. But I actually think it's quite a nice thing to do. When I've walked down the Mall, when there's a state visit, I think it looks amazing. It looks great, seeing the Union flags everywhere. And there will be towns and villages and cities and parishes where they might say, well, actually, we would quite like the idea of having flags, maybe even permanently, put up on lampposts in a way that was agreed with the council in advance, where they were quality items, where they had maybe those poles at the top and the bottom that fix them in. That might be particularly appropriate and relevant, for example, in some of the towns and villages near us. We live really quite near to a RAF base. RAF Base Norton is very near to us. We're also not all that far away from Royal Wootton Bassett, which is where a lot of soldiers who tragically died in conflict have been repatriated in recent years. There might be that these places decide actually we'd like to do that, and there ought to be an official means and an official channel for doing it. Two final points I wanted to make. One of them is just to echo your point that local councils have to be painfully consistent on this sort of thing. It's no good giving the impression to people that one type of flag, particularly if it's your own country's flag, is treated more harshly than the flag of another country. We just generally have to make sure, and councils, I think, have to make sure that you are not feeding the flames of discontent from people who feel like that is the way in which things go. They may be wrong to think that, but we cannot be adding fuel to those flames. The second thing I wanted to mention, so I read a book review. I've not read the book, I should say, but I read a book review the other day in the London Review of Books of a book called Hyperpolitics by Anton Jaeger. And with apologies if I pronounce the surname incorrectly. It's J-A with an umlaut, G-E-R. And in this book, Hyperpolitics, from what I could make of it, it distinguishes between politicization and institutionalization, i.e., if I oversimplify these, how political are people feeling and is society, and how robust is its institutional framework to give form to those political ambitions. And one of the arguments that can easily be made, I think this book does make, is that we're now in a period where people feel actually really quite political. Sometimes they feel politically hopeless, but it's a form of political feeling anyway, or sometimes they feel politically very highly motivated. But that the institutional framework that their political energy would have traditionally been channeled into is in quite a weak state. So the traditional parties that do still dominate the House of Commons to a large degree and still run most councils in the country, etc., they have declining membership. We've got insurgent parties which don't necessarily have internal form, which can be used to channel these things constructively. Lots of civic societies, if we think about a lot of that communitarian literature and analysis of society, and from everything from the Women's Institute to the local history guild to parish councils and all the things that people historically may have got involved in that would have been communal acts through which political ambition or community ambition could have been channeled. They're not as robust as they once were. We shouldn't overly idealize, say, the mid-20th century as times when these were much stronger, but I think certainly we can say that today it has declined compared to what it was then. So why do I mention that? Mainly because I think this raising of the flags and this whole raising the colour operation is an example of people who feel highly political. They feel highly politically motivated to go out, to buy the flags, to organise people to put them up, to do that as a statement which is clearly intended to be interpreted politically. It's not like putting up a flag for a jubilee, which is just meant as an expression of patriotism. It's clearly intended when people do it at the moment. Yes, to be an expression of patriotism, but within a context in which they feel that needs expressing because it's being maligned or we're not being patriotic enough day to day. But they don't necessarily have, beyond the groups that are doing it themselves, they don't have an established structure that can turn that into policy or political action. They just have a way of expressing their political discontent, rather like a form of protest. They're not set up to maybe lobby councillors to put more flags up ordinarily in formal and official ways, or express some of the myriad policy positions or discontents that may be motivating them at some level. They're not, from what I can tell, in a position to challenge that into something that would be constructive and likely achieve policy ends. They're just in a position to sort of express their political outrage as another form of protest, which is not a particularly useful position to be in for anybody who has political aims.
Just to pick up on a couple of points. You talked about the neutrality that councils must have. And I agree with that to a large extent. And I think, look, if the law says people can't affix anything to public infrastructure without permission, then councils have a responsibility to enforce that rule. That being said, I think there is something different about our national flags compared to other flags. You know, look, if someone wanted to fly a Vote Labour flag on a lamppost, even if it's a flag I agree with, even if it's a flag supporting me in this town council by-election, I tell them don't do it because it's not allowed. It's against the regulations that we have regarding public infrastructure. I would not be cross if the council took down Vote Labour flags that someone had put on a lamppost in advance of the town council election here. That just seems to me to be the appropriate thing to do. But that is not the same as saying that councils should be neutral on the question of flying our national flags in the appropriate spaces. There, I think there should be a bias, a favouritism to flying the flags of Britain and England if you're in England, or Britain and Scotland if you're in Scotland, and Britain and Wales if you're in Wales, etc. And we do, I think, in Britain have a somewhat, particularly in England, a somewhat curious and, in my view, wrong-headed anxiety, particularly among more middle-class people in this country, about the flying of our national flags. And people say, well, not everyone is English, or not everyone sees themselves as British, and so on. But you're in Britain, you're in England. I mean, I spent a lot of my childhood in the US. Americans love flying their flag. We were not offended when we saw the American flag being flown by our neighbours or by our local town council, or at my school. In every classroom, there was an American flag flying. And although I didn't identify as American, you know, we weren't an American family. We were an English family who were effectively temporary economic migrants in America. We were understanding of that was our position in the country. We were guests in the United States. Americans were entitled to be proud of their country and proud of their flag. And I was happy for them to do that. And so I would say the same should apply here, that when we fly our British and English flag, it doesn't mean that we say that everyone who lives here has to identify as English or everyone has to identify as British, but it's not inappropriate for the British state and for people in Britain and English local authorities, local government, to display those colours. Absolutely fine.
I think that's a well-made point. Certainly what I intended to say is that councils mustn't give the impression that there is a bias against domestic flags being raised, because that will only make social relations worse and will inflame people's feelings. I don't think it's unreasonable to have a bias in favour of flying national flags within your own country. And in this case, right, that can be, of course, the Union flag, the St George's Cross, the Welsh flag with its dragon, the Scottish saltire, the St Patrick's Cross in Northern Ireland, and so on. You know, there's a great rich tapestry of flags that we have in this country. County flags as well, of course, which are somewhat forgotten and overlooked and do have a slight habit of being awfully ugly, which is a little bit of a shame. There's some great studies that have been done into the aesthetics of flags, and that find case studies of some which are incredibly attractive and well designed. I happen to think the Union flag is one of those, and some which are stunningly awful, of which certainly as you go more local all over the world, as you go more local beneath the national level, you find more and more of those, but that's a distraction.
And my final point on the matter of the flags is that the best way, I think, to ensure that the British flag or the English flag does not become the property of a single ideological positioning or particular political movement is for all of us, whatever our politics is, to feel that we should be able to fly our flag proudly as part of one community, one nation, one country.
Just to finish this episode, I did just want to say one final thing, which is actually just to say good luck to everybody who is actually involved in the local elections going on in the United Kingdom at the moment, and in particular to the party volunteers who have the much more thankless tasks of trying to help keep the political parties active. Richard and I were talking just the other day about how some of the real unsung heroes in this country are people who never put their own name forward to stand for election, but will be the people who give up their home to be a committee room, stuff envelopes for local government candidates. It's really unglamorous work, and they do it selflessly. And whilst it's not obvious perhaps to a lot of people how valuable that work is, if we were a country in which parties did not compete for our votes as proactively as they still pretty much do in very, very great many parts of the UK. And actually, I think political campaigning is now more intense in the UK than it was a few years ago, as we get fewer safe constituencies, fewer safe wards, and far more parties competing for support. It would be much worse not to have that level of political activity than to live in a country that is a vibrant democracy in which people are fighting for votes. And there is usually a great team of people behind the person whose name is on the ballot who deserve as much, if not more, credit for making that happen as a person who is standing. Well, that's all for this midweek episode of Since Attlee and Churchill. We'll be back on Sunday when we're starting a new mini-series. We're going to be looking at a whole series of strikes with enormous political impact. And we're starting, as it's a centenary of it at the moment, with the general strike of 1926. That will be available on Sunday morning, wherever you get your podcast from. And if you subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, Apple, wherever, then you'll be notified, I hope, of when it comes out. We'll see you then.
Thanks very much.